My Lords, I hope you'll forgive this intrusion into your councils. I'm not a full member of your committee, although I have read this excellent report cover to cover. I'm only a member of one of your subcommittees, a lowly member of the subcommittee on the Northern Ireland Protocol, so I feel rather like a fourth former who's kind of wandered into the prefect's lounge, and I'm going to try and squeak out my message as briefly as possible. And I really have just 3 points to make. The first is a warm endorsement of what my noble friend Lord Billy just said about visas, and specifically work-related visas, the ability for people to come and do business. It's a completely separate issue from inward migration, and I would very much like for ministers to consider a Commonwealth business visa. By all means, make it difficult to qualify and have a high threshold for the turnover of the company and so on, but once you've qualified, once you've got it, you should be allowed to travel to all participating Commonwealth states that have opted into the scheme. Secondly, I'd like to make a point that follows on from what my noble friend Viscount Trenchard said about the Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive. I was a member of the European Parliament when the AIFMD was produced. And this was one of those occasions when the UK was strongly against it. Lord Liddell pointed out that we often supported these regulations. Well, not on this occasion. There was an almost unanimous opposition to it, not only across the industry but across the city more widely. It was seen as a needless burden. So why has it not been repealed? Well, here I think we come across a very interesting dynamic in the nature of regulation, which is that once companies have assimilated the compliance costs, they lose all interest in repeal. In fact, it's worse than that. They see no reason why a competitor company should come and outcompete them by not having to jump through all the hoops that they did. And so, and the field of the AIFMD is a very good example, the people who were most strongly against the regulation when it was proposed have now become its advocates and defenders because they see it as a way of raising barriers to entry. Now, those of us in this House, my Lord, and those of us who are in government in any sense, should not be thinking only of the established producers. We need to think about the startups. We need to think about the companies that don't exist yet. And we need to think about the consumers. We need to think about the overall competitiveness of the city rather than the convenience of some established players. I pick AIFMD simply because the Lord Trenchard mentioned it, but I think there are a number of areas where this pertains, not least in the field of financial services. We're having a lengthy debate in another part of our building about the retained EU law legislation, but we have a real problem, never mind the source of this, with repealing anything if we begin from the point of view that if the industry is in favour of a regulation, that is the beginning and end of the argument. We need to raise our eyes to more distant horizons. My third and main point is about Chapter 2 of your excellent report. And I add my congratulations to those of Lord Liddell for the chairman, the Earl of Kinnoul, who's done an extraordinarily good job, as far as I can see, albeit from the outside. On equivalence, look, the EU has every right to behave as a sovereign entity. If it chooses, and the phrase that you use in this report, to prioritise politics over economics. If it chooses, in other words, to put this at its most brutal, to make itself slightly poorer in order to teach us a lesson, to inconvenience its own companies, to deny them unfettered access to the world's deepest and cheapest money markets in order to make a point, that is absolutely its right. It's not for us to cavil or quarrel. But it's vital that we do not fall into the trap of thinking the same way. The prosperity of the City of London survived the decline of sterling as an international currency in the early 20th century because it remained open, because we had a light touch attitude to regulation, and because we did not discriminate on grounds of nationality against companies from other countries and indeed other continents. And by the way, I would extend this argument about non-retaliation to almost all the fields where we see some asymmetry between EU and UK policy. For example, EU citizens, as I'm sure most of us by now have noticed, are free to use our e-gates when they enter the United Kingdom. The EU has chosen not to return the favour, so we have to queue up and get our passports stamped. Well, that's fine. That is their right. If they want to make it more difficult for every other non-EU national, for every Indian, American, and so on, in the end, that is at their own loss and at their own expense. It would be crazy for us not to remain open and welcoming, including to our friends from Europe. I'd make, by the way, the same point about goods traffic. We've spent a lot of time on my subcommittee looking at the EU's claim that they have to have these checks in Ireland. It's striking that there has never been an equivalent argument from the UK. At no stage has the British government said, we need checks in Northern Ireland in order to preserve the integrity of our market. By the way, we haven't even imposed such checks on EU goods coming in through other routes, and quite rightly, because we should trust EU regulators. We've been importing stuff from our European allies and neighbours for decades. It would be crazy for us to have a panoply of expensive regulation purely with the effect of slowing things up and making things harder for our importers, especially of component parts. If others, the great argument used by an economist 100 years ago in this country, if others choose to put rocks in their harbours, we should not retaliate by putting rocks in our harbours. I think that the asymmetry on equivalence that you discuss in this report is based on a very widespread fallacy. Let's call it the mercantilist fallacy. An awful lot of people, including, I have to say, a lot of my former colleagues in the European Parliament, believe that the strength of an economy depends on exports, believe that there's some virility in having a big trade surplus. Now, this argument was, of course, debunked by Adam Smith 2.5 centuries ago. There's no point in amassing a big surplus for no reason. The real drive to economic growth comes from cheaper imports that frees up people's time and resources to do other things and drive domestic growth. But it's always difficult to make that argument as an elected politician because it's counterintuitive and people tend to think that the success of another is at their own expense. In fact, the great 18th century philosopher David Hume put it beautifully, if you will allow me to quote him, my lords. Nothing is more usual among states which have made some advances in commerce than to look on the progress of their neighbours with a suspicious eye, to consider all trading states as their rivals, and to suppose that it is impossible for any of them to flourish but at their expense. In opposition to this narrow and malignant opinion, says Hume, I will venture to assert that the increase in riches and commerce in any one nation so far from hurting commonly promotes the riches and commerce of all its neighbours. And that, my lords, is why we should want the EU to flourish. That is why we should never make the mistake of raising barriers, whether in financial services or in other forms of trade. We have, of course, an obligation to them as our long-standing friends and allies. But even if we were to look at this in a narrowly selfish way, even if we were to be without a drop of altruism, it would be crazy for us to impoverish our neighbours. We want our neighbours to be as rich as possible because that makes them better customers and that therefore spills over into our own prosperity. If they can't see that, well, we can only lead by example and hope that they will eventually understand what is in their own advantage. But they, as I say, are a sovereign union. Our country was raised to the highest opulence simply by the expediency of dropping its barriers from the 1830s and 1840s onwards and inviting the traffic and commerce of the world without obstacles. It led to an improvement in living standards, especially for the poorest people, which every foreign visitor to Victorian Britain was struck by. Now we live again in a world which is turning towards protectionism in the United States, in the European Union, in China, and almost everywhere else. And once again, I think it falls to this country to be the apostle of unrestricted commerce and to tell the story of free trade as the great liberator, the most effective means there is for conflict resolution, for social justice, and for poverty alleviation.